What is going on today, guys? My name's Alex. Welcome back to the channel. Today we are back with this 2023 F150 with the 5-liter Coyote V8 in her. And behind this truck we have a, well, pretty well loaded 8,200 pound trailer behind it. And we're gonna see how well this 5-liter Coyote engine tows with the load behind it. Right to 7,000 RPM. Woo! So like I mentioned, we have 8,200 pounds, or just over that anyways, and we have a little bit over 800 pounds of tongue weight on this truck. Now the max towing capacity for the 5-liter Coyote engine is 13,000 pounds. However, the truck we have right behind me here, its max towing capacity is only 9,400 pounds. So with this weight, we are just about 90% of this truck's max towing capacity. So that should give us a really good idea of how this truck is gonna tow. Now in the future, I may actually add a couple hundred pounds to this trailer for my 1500s. I'd like to be right around 8,500 pounds, but for now, this is perfect because a couple weeks ago, I towed the exact same trailer, same weight, same position on the trailer, same tongue weight with a 3.5 liter EcoBoost. And so we're gonna have a really good head-to-head comparison between the 5-liter and the EcoBoost. So our unloaded fender height is, I believe, 40 1/4. Yes, just about 40 1/4, we'll go with that. And now that we're loaded, 37 1/2. So this thing dropped about 3/4 inch more than the EcoBoost. It's the exact same truck. Could be the location of where we got the truck and trailer. I measured the other side, it's the exact same. So I'm not sure why this thing dropped more, but maybe we'll remeasure on some more flatter asphalt and see what happens. So as you guys can see with my beautiful artistic marking here, our block is in the exact same position on the exact same trailer. All right, so now that we're on some flatter asphalt here, yeah, 37 1/2. So yeah, this thing squatted an extra 3/8 of an inch. Not entirely sure why. Could have to do with the weights of the engine, but it should be the exact same truck and chassis, just with a different engine. I don't know. Maybe you guys can tell me in the comments why this thing squats a little more. Let's put this truck in drive and drive her down the highway and see what this 5-liter engine's all about when towing. All right, so right off the bat, just bombing around the neighborhood here. It is quite obvious the difference in low-end torque. That EcoBoost just has so much torque down low, which we'll talk about later in the video here, as well as the RPMs. Whenever you want to accelerate, the revs they're a little bit higher in this truck, and that is just to be expected. We are about to jump on the highway here. I believe with the EcoBoost, I started at 62 kilometers an hour. Sometimes it's just hard to get that speed right where you want it before you drop the hammer. So we'll see if we can get to 62 here. All right, boom, to the floor. Right to 7,000 RPM, woo! Yes, the download torque is not there, but that upper end power, woo! Once this engine gets revving, there is some serious muscle there. That's impressive, that is impressive. So I slowed these two clips down just so we could see a good comparison, and the 5-liter does a really good job keeping up with the EcoBoost, which is a really quick engine. Obviously the EcoBoost is a little bit faster, but all in all, the 5-liter really holds its weight there. So we are about 15 kilometers into our towing journey here of 180 kilometers. And so we have set the speed to 110 as we always do, and we're just gonna let the truck do its thing without much input from me, because I think that's the fairest way to test the ability of the truck. Anyways, but in terms of how this truck feels, it definitely likes to be higher in the RPM bands than the EcoBoost. I mean, here's a perfect example. We're going up a slight hill here, and we're in 7th gear, 1-to-1, 2,500 RPM, where the EcoBoost, well, it would usually sit at a much higher gear, simply because of that low end torque. So that's the first thing I noticed. In terms of power, there is a lot of it. It just has to be higher in the RPM band. And now we've dropped to 6th gear, and you can definitely hear that V8 rumble along there. But once she drops a gear, plenty of power for sure. The other thing I've noticed right away is the fuel economy. So 22.8 liters per 100 kilometers is not great, but it is a lot better than what I had with the EcoBoost at this point in my run. So I'm really interested on that. We'll see how that plays out. So this 5-liter Coyote engine is not your typical pushrod V8. This is a dual overhead cam V8, which Ford designed to be able to rev much higher than your traditional naturally aspirated V8 engine. Now, when this engine debuted in 2011, this was Ford's idea from the get-go to have a smaller displacement naturally aspirated V8 that could compete with larger displacement naturally aspirated V8s, specifically GM's 6.2-liter LS engine. Ford wanted to have something that could compete in terms of power numbers, but in a smaller displacement package, and this is what Ford came up with. Now, this engine has the ability to rev much higher than those larger displacement V8 engines. This engine in this truck will rev to 7,000 RPM in comparison to GM's, first of all, their 5.3, which will rev to only 5,800 RPM, and their 6.2, which will rev to 6,000 RPM. So that is how Ford is able to squeeze out more power out of a smaller displacement engine by giving it the ability to make much higher top end power in that higher RPM band. So it is cool that Ford can squeeze out that much power out of a smaller displacement V8, but when it comes to towing, which obviously we're doing today, what happens is your peak torque is much higher in the RPM band. So the peak torque for this engine is at 4,300 RPM. Now, for example, a couple weeks ago when I towed with the EcoBoost, that peak torque was at 3,100 RPM. So the EcoBoost hits its peak torque over 1,000 RPM lower, which is what you want when you're towing. So unfortunately, in order to make the same power to the wheels when towing, it's gonna have to rev, first of all, a lot more than the EcoBoost, as well as the competitor's larger displacement V8s, because those engines don't have to rev as high to get those same powers. So that is kind of what I mean when I say the design of the 5-liter Coyote engine is going to result in some higher revs when towing, simply because that is where it makes a lot of its power, is higher in that RPM band. So this should be a good example. This is a nothing hill. It's just a little bit of an incline, but I remember the EcoBoost didn't shift out of 9th gear and just boosted up the engine. So we'll see if this 5-liter can stay in 9th gear. No. See, there you go. We just shifted to 7th gear, which is a 1-to-1, and we're at 2,500 RPM in order to maintain the same speed, where that EcoBoost, it just simply added boost to the engine and just kept on rolling at like 1,700 RPM. Now, in terms of gearing, there are actually 3 options when it comes to the 5-liter and this F150. The first option is the 315 gears, but that is only available in a 2-wheel drive setup, so it is what it is. In terms of 4-wheel drive setups, you can get the 331s or the 373s. We have the 331s in this truck, which is what's giving us our 9,400 pound max towing capacity. If you want that 13,000 pounds of max towing capacity, you need to equip this thing with 373 gears, and that'll get you there. Now, speaking of gearing, this thing has a 10-speed transmission in it, the exact same as the EcoBoost, and there are a couple quirks when it comes to towing with this thing. So when you're in tow haul mode, you won't be able to go into 10th gear, which is a heavy overdrive gear. I believe it's like 0.64 to 1, which is a heavy overdrive gear. Even 9th gear is 0.68 to 1, which is again a pretty deep overdrive gear. 1-to-1 is 7th gear. Currently we are in 6th gear, which is an underdrive gear, in order to keep our speed up this hill here. So you hear me talk a lot about overdrive, underdrive gears. So I figured I'd just kind of talk about quickly. 7th gear is 1-to-1, and what that means is the crankshaft in the engine is going to be spinning the exact same speed as the dry shaft leaving the transmission going to your wheels. So that is 1-to-1, means it's going the exact same speed. And in underdrive gear, which is gear 1 to 6 in this truck, means that the crankshaft is going to be spinning faster than the dry shaft leaving the transmission. So that's an underdrive. And then we also have what's called an overdrive. And this transmission gear 8, 9, 10 are considered overdrive, and that's when the crankshaft is spinning slower than the dry shaft leaving to again spin those wheels. Now, what really impressed me a couple weeks ago with the EcoBoost was how it had the ability to stay in an overdrive gear or a 1-to-1 gear almost all of the time. And that takes a lot of torque from the engine to maintain that gearing, especially when towing a load. So it just goes to show how the EcoBoost just has a monstrous amount of torque. But it'll be interesting to see with this 5-liter how it does, if it can actually maintain an overdrive gear for most of the time, or if we are going to be sitting in underdrive gear, which is where this engine will probably tend to be a little bit thirsty because it's going to have to be at higher RPMs to maintain that underdrive gear. Now, lastly about gearing, that hill we just kind of ran there, this truck was in 6th gear all the way up, where the EcoBoost was able to maintain a 1-to-1 gear ratio in 7th gear. And again, it just goes to the fact that the EcoBoost just has so much more torque down low. In fact, that EcoBoost made 90% of its 500 foot-pounds of torque by 1700 RPM. So by 1700 RPM, it's making 450 pound-feet of torque, which is more than this truck makes in total, only at 410. So, I mean, it is to be expected that this truck is just gonna have to downshift quite a bit more in order to maintain your speed and get that power to the wheels. But what I do find quite fascinating is the fuel economy. So despite this truck having to rev a lot higher at times, our fuel economy is significantly better, almost 4 liters per 100 kilometers less than what it was at this exact same time with the EcoBoost. Let's see how this engine does on a little bit of a downhill stretch. We're going down back into the valley, and we'll see if this thing can keep 110 kilometers an hour, which is what our cruise control is pinned at. Well, 113, not doing so good here. 114, 116. When's this thing gonna downshift? Okay, 6th gear. I mean, like, let's downshift again here, Ford. Okay, you're just gonna stay at 116. The EcoBoost did the exact same thing. It must be a Ford thing. I wish it would stay closer to the speed that you're requesting. I know it's probably got like a buffer where, like, you know, 5 kilometers over or above, it won't do too much. 117. I mean, we're almost at 120 kilometers an hour. This thing just refused to downshift. That's weird. That's kind of weird. I don't know why that did that. All right, we made her halfway. We're at the old truck stop here. Yeah, she's doing pretty well. I mean, always impressed with this F-150 in terms of the chassis. It just takes this load really well for a 1500 in my opinion. I still don't know why this is squatting a little more than the EcoBoost. Like, I can definitely notice the front end is up a little bit more as well. It's the exact same load, it's in the exact same position. I don't know, kind of a head scratcher if I'm gonna be honest. But in terms of performance, I think this truck's doing pretty well. It's tough to compare this to the EcoBoost because the power numbers are just so much more than this 5-liter V8. But I mean, as expected, she is revving a little more. The engine's having to work a little bit harder, seemingly at least. In general, towing this big trailer, I think it's doing just fine. I think it would pull its max towing capacity pretty seamlessly without too much drama, and that's always kind of the goal. All right, so as we jump back on the highway, we're gonna do another acceleration test. As always, we're gonna start at 60, go to 110, put my foot through the floor. Well, try to anyways. So let's get her up to 60. All right, to the floor. Woo! This thing screams. Oh yeah. Oh, 7,000 RPM. That's, woo! That sound, it's just nothing really like it in comparison to the EcoBoost anyways. All right, we are coming to the biggest pull on the course. Up we go the hill, let's see. All right, 6th gear. 3,100 RPM. Wow! know. She seems like she's gonna stay in gear here. Oh shit, I might get jammed up here. Well, we're gonna have to bump the speed up so I don't get jammed. Again, this is weird, I have to say. So, okay, so I just bumped the speed up so I didn't get jammed up by that truck and a car coming this way, but I want 116 kilometers an hour. We are at 110. Like, why won't this truck upshift? That's so strange. Like, am I gonna manually have, there. Oh. What is with that? That doesn't make much sense to me. Kind of odd why the truck doesn't like to stay at the speed you want it to be at. Like, I know with my Rams, I mean, if I want 110, it'll stay at 110 or try its best to do that. Likewise, on the way up, if I wanted 110, it would keep 110, and if not, it would downshift. So I don't know, weird. Either way, it seemed like there was a good amount of power. The truck didn't really struggle too much at all with this load up that relatively big hill, so that's good to see. So going up another hill here, here's another example of this truck not upshifting. I mean, so I'm 105, I'm 10 kilometers under where I want, or 5 kilometers where I want to be. It should downshift to 4th gear, or 3rd, or 5th gear there, sorry. I mean, yes, we're climbing, but I mean, I know for a fact my Ram would have shifted gears about 20 seconds ago. So now we're at 110, it's all good. But it seems so lackadaisical with this truck. I don't remember this with the EcoBoost. Maybe you guys can tell me what you think or your experiences with towing, but I mean, you would think this truck would downshift in order to keep speed rather than letting the speed drop, and then slowly bringing it up. I would expect to see a much more snappy response from the truck. So other than that, like, lack of responsiveness, I really can't point anything else wrong with this 5-liter Coyote engine. I mean, it's been a relatively really good towing experience. We just hit 180 kilometers on our route here, so we're just about finished up. And I mean, I thought the EcoBoost would be head and shoulders a better towing engine than this 5-liter, but I mean, without a doubt, it is a better engine in terms of towing ability, no question, but the gap is not as big as I thought. This engine is not that much of a drop-off in terms of, you know, power and performance when towing compared to the EcoBoost, which I think is a really, really good thing. This 5-liter is very capable. Yes, like I mentioned many times, you are gonna have to deal with some higher revs, but the power is there. Now, where there is a gap between these two engines is the fuel economy. This truck is gonna finish with 19.6 or thereabout liters per 100 kilometers, which is a significantly better fuel economy than the EcoBoost with, again, the exact same trailer, exact load. It does really make the EcoBoost look really, really thirsty in terms of fuel because this is a much bigger displacement engine and it drank a lot less fuel on the same route with the same trailer. So, I mean, that is something to take into consideration if you guys are planning on towing with these engines. The 5-liter is going to be a much more economic engine when it comes to towing, surprisingly enough. All right, we are back in the shop here, and just want to talk about a couple things before we kind of end the video here, or also known as a conclusion, I guess. So after a total review of the EcoBoost, I said I would rather buy the 5-liter than the EcoBoost simply because of potential longevity, reliability things, and I think this engine is quite a bit more simpler than that EcoBoost, less things to go wrong, if you will. But the one thing I was pretty convinced is that the EcoBoost was going to be a much, much better towing engine, and if you were planning on towing a lot, the EcoBoost would probably be the better option. But I'm pleasantly surprised to say that this 5-liter really kind of stood on its own 2 feet, and Yes, it is not as good of a towing engine against the EcoBoost, clearly, because I mean, on paper alone, the EcoBoost it has more power, but the gap is not as big as I thought it was going to be. This thing is a great towing engine, and if you get the 373 gears, you know, you can tow up to 13,000 pounds, which is a fair amount of weight with a 1500. The second thing which I was not prepared to see was the fuel economy. And I hate to say it, or it's weird to say that a, you know, V8 is going to have good fuel economy, but in comparison to the EcoBoost, once again, this thing was very efficient, finishing with 19.5 liters per 100 kilometers. The EcoBoost, which we tested a couple weeks ago, 22.5. So this thing was a full 3 liters per 100 kilometers better on fuel economy while towing, which that is pretty significant. And you know, this thing is a very efficient V8 to begin with, but it just goes to show that the EcoBoost is thirsty. So, you know, there's some give and take there in terms of towing ability and fuel economy. Moral of the story is both the 3.5 EcoBoost and this 5-liter Coyote engine are both really good towing engines, and I don't think you're necessarily going to go wrong with either one depending on which you choose. As always, guys, I always like to hear what you guys have to say. Anyways, hopefully you guys enjoyed this little towing series, little towing comparison between the notorious F150 engines here. Hopefully I can get the 2.7 liter EcoBoost on the channel soon. That'll be fun also to kind of throw a third engine on the comparison list in terms of F150s. If you like the video, don't forget to leave that thumbs up. And if you like cool stuff like this, don't forget to subscribe because we got lots of towing to do. Anyways, enough of me. We'll see you in the next freaking video, guys.